There's a lot of information we need to convey on this lesson. And it's here at Massey, as you know, we teach it as a separate lesson as well. You go out and all you do is taxi around for half an hour on this particular lesson. I also think that is very valuable to a student, to not include it as part of the effects of controls lesson. Because I don't know if you guys remember back to when you were students, but the taxiing here is dreadful at the start. So the students do need some practice at that, just focusing on it. So it gives them the opportunity, and then they can consolidate on that in subsequent flights. So know that there is a difference between how it's often done in the industry and how we do it here at Massey, and it varies from place to place, okay? Because it's the first mass brief, this is where you would tell them, so every lesson you come in, this is what a typical lesson will look like. We'll do a mass brief, and then 3 days later, or whatever, we'll do the flight, and on that day we do a pre-flight briefing. This is where you'd introduce to them what are the sections of a mass brief. So I'm not going to go through that because that's the stuff I just talked to you about. So you tell them, okay, there'll be a title, there'll be objectives, what all of this stuff means, there's principles of flight, considerations, all that stuff I just talked to you about, and the stuff that's in those notes I just gave you, okay, because this is the first time, so they need to know, what is this going to look like every time I come in for a lesson? If it's out in the industry, what do I have to do in this hour and a half that I'm here for? I find it helpful to always tell the student how long the briefing will take approximately, so I'll endeavour to remember to do this when I'm delivering these, but this one probably about 30 to 40 minutes for taxiing, I would say. Probably the most important question for you to start off with is, have they ever been in a light aeroplane? Have they ever flown before? Have they done a trial flight? Have they done any, do they have a few hours under their belt? You need to know that. And you've got to assess that right now, because this briefing gets a whole heap easier if they've already done taxiing and several other lessons. You can ask more questions and you don't have to teach concepts as much. What I would say to you though is DA-40s are not a common aeroplane in the country, so even if they do have previous experience, it's likely to be on Pipers or Cessnas, and the nose wheel steering is different in a DA-40 than both of those aeroplanes. So it's important to actually ask them, hey, what was that experience in? Because there may still be relevant things that you have to cover in this briefing, even if they are quite an experienced student pilot. So that's kind of the instructional technique stuff for this slide. Now I'll talk to you a little bit about how I'd introduce the rest of the briefing. So we're going to talk about what taxiing actually is, so define that to the student. Ask them, maybe they know, maybe they've seen documentaries or have some flying experience. So, but taxiing is really manoeuvring around on the ground under the influence of the aircraft's own power. So that's what we mean, okay? So it sets the context of what is this thing, what is taxiing, define it, okay? I will try to give you a bit of time to write, but if I'm going too quick, please just tell me to stop, okay? I like to tell them or talk a little bit about why is this important here. Well, aircraft are less manoeuvrable than the car or the bike that this person may drive. So ask them, do they drive? Do they ride a bike? Because there's actually a lot of things I talk about in this briefing where I relate it back to actually driving a car. But if they don't drive, well, then you've got to use a bicycle. And if they don't ride a bicycle, well, then you're out of luck. So ask them that. So aircraft are less manoeuvrable. They don't have a gear stick, so we can't put it into reverse if we get ourselves into a spot where there's not enough space to manoeuvre. And they're a lot wider than a car. We tend to forget about these 12 meters wingspan that we have to take into account. So that gives some relevance about why you're actually teaching this, all right? Here's our objective. Now it's up to you whether you read it to them or you let them read it and then expand on it. It's up to you. To learn how to maneuver the aircraft on the ground safely and accurately under various conditions during normal and emergency situations. Notice how I emphasized a few key words there, because that's what I want you to expand on. So what do we mean by safely? Well, we're meaning with control of the aeroplane's speed and control of the direction. We never want to lose control of the aeroplane. And what do we mean by accurately? or we mean being able to develop your judgment about how much space does this aeroplane require to maneuver whilst we taxi it around on the ground. And where there are taxi lines, like out your window there, those yellow lines, accurately might also mean being able to keep the aeroplane on those lines. So give some examples of what you mean by that. Various conditions. So it's not a very nice day out the window there, as you can see today. So it'll be important for us to learn about the considerations of taxiing an aeroplane on days where it is wet, days where it is dry, days where it is windy, as well as different surface types and slopes. And emergencies are very rare, but what we're talking about here when we refer to emergency situations is really a brake failure. So we're going to learn today about what to do in the event that we do have a brake failure. Whenever you see a briefing with the word emergency or accident or incident, make sure you provide some assurance to your student there. Make no mistake, there are plenty of really nervous students out there in the early days, and if they see that word and you don't qualify what you're meaning, that may be the very last time you'll ever see them for a flight. So that has happened to me as a young CCAT before. I had a woman who was terrified. I don't even know why she came in the first place, but never saw her again. So make sure you reassure your passengers, your students, okay? So there's our objective. That's what we're looking to achieve by the end of this lesson. So why do we have to learn this? So we're carrying on with this, expanding on the theme of why they need to know about it. Here's our aircraft parked out on the apron here. Now, there's several different places we might have to taxi to before we can take off. Well, we've got to get out to the runway. We've got a sealed runway. We've got a sealed runway we've got to be able to taxi out to. We might have to taxi to the fuel pumps. We might have to taxi out to a holding point where we can do our pre-takeoff and engine checks. So we've got to be familiar with the airfield layout as well. So I point out to them that a part of this lesson is to become familiar with the taxiways, the holding points, and the runways that we have available. And that's what I give them as homework at the end. Show them where to find that so they can start reading up on it. So that's the why. Essentially what I've just talked about. Don't ever read word for word what's on there, okay? You need to be sufficiently familiar with what is on the slide so that you can talk to it. You don't face this way and read that, okay? So use your speaker notes, which come up on the side of the screen there, to get an idea of what's coming up next so you can link without having to read the slides. Not all briefings have an overview slide like this, only few do. This is just a summary of the things that we're going to look at today. So today we'll be looking at how to control the aeroplane's direction, so how to steer, speed control, how to slow down and brake, including stopping. This wind quartering is about how to make allowance for varying wind conditions, strength and directions whilst we're taxiing. The surface type and slope. We have to learn about other traffic whilst we are taxiing around on the ground. There are rules that we have to be aware of, just like there are rules in your car for driving, there are rules for an aeroplane. We'll talk about aircraft size. So there's many different aircraft that will fly during your career, so we need to think about some of the considerations of varying aircraft sizes. And there are taxi checks, instrument serviceability checks I'll introduce you to today, and then, as I mentioned, a brief discussion on the emergency of a brake failure. So not much information needs to be given here, okay? Just very, very briefly, a sentence, a couple of words on each of those bullet points, and then move on. We're going to expand on it later. So try to tell stories as you are going through these slides. So let's say we've done our pre-flight briefing, we're doing our taxi lesson today, so we walked out into got into the airplane, started the engine up, we talked to the controller, and they've given us permission to taxi down to the main apron to do our pre-takeoff checks. So one of the first things we're going to need to do when the airplane starts moving is do a brake check. See how that leads you into this slide? So you can set a scenario to lead you into each different slide, all right? With this slide, it all comes up in one click. So where I suggest you start is talk about what's being shown over here, talk about how the feet should normally be positioned on the pedals, then come back up to the bullet points and talk about this slide. So it's kind of zigzagging your way around. So I present it as this. So what we're having a look at over here are the rudder and brake pedals for a DA40. And these may look a little bit different than the aeroplane they've flown, if they have flown one. These little bars here, these circular bars, are the rudder bars, and they control the direction. But up here are the brake pads. So we've got a left-hand brake pad, we've got a right-hand brake pad for the two main wheels. We don't have a brake for the nose wheel. So give some background knowledge about the systems, okay? Normally when we are taxiing around on the ground, this is how we position our feet. Our heel should be on the floor and only our toes are on the rudder bar portion, this lower portion of the pedal here. We don't want to ride the brakes. We do not keep our feet on the brakes unless they actually need to be. But when we do want to stop, that's when you come back up here, we close the throttle. There's some jargon you're going to have to introduce here. So what does close the throttle mean? Well, on a lawnmower, you know, there's a idle cutoff setting and then there's a high power setting. And the aeroplane's throttle looks and functions a little bit like that. So if we push the throttle forward, the power increases, and if we pull the throttle back, the power decreases. The difference in an aeroplane is when you pull the throttle all the way back, the engine does not cut out. So just spend a moment to actually talk about what you mean by closing the throttle. Closing the throttle means bringing the throttle out to its idle position, its minimum power setting. So we close the throttle, and then when we want to slow down or stop, we slide both of our feet up onto the brake pads as indicated in this diagram and smoothly press down evenly on both pads at the same time. We don't need to stomp our feet on them. The more you press down on them, the faster the more the deceleration will be. So make sure you're teaching that side. It's just like in a car. So if you stamp your foot on the car brake, you're going to stop really quickly. If you only press slightly, you're not going to stop as quick. Relate it to that, because it's every day. Most people drive, so they know. So that's how to slow down and stop. There may be times after we've stopped where we also want to engage the parking brake. An example of this would be when we have taxied to the main apron and we're about to do our pre-takeoff checks, or maybe we're sat at a holding point waiting to take off. So this is how we use the park brake. We come to a complete stop first, and then we have the park brake lever, which is just below the ignition switch. The keys are just up here where the laser is, and you've got these silver levers. The park brake is this one on the right-hand side. You'll see it's got a lock position and a release position. Make sure you remember which one is which, but it is labelled there. So when we want to set the park brake on, we come to a complete stop using the toe brakes. Set the park brake lever to the on position, and then we have to pressurize the brake lines. So we put our feet back on the brake pads if they're not there already, pump them a few times, and that will pressurize the brakes. But always leave your feet on the brake pads just in case it hasn't pressurized. When we want to release it, quite simple, we just move the lever to the off position or release position. Notice how we're not talking about the whole bring the throttle back to idle here before engaging it. That comes up later on in the air exercise. This is just the basics of how to actually set the park brake. So we've just started taxiing off the main apron here. We've done our brake check. You've now learned also how to set the parking brake. One of the next things we're going to need to do is control the speed of the aeroplane. So that leads you into this one. So the maximum speed for taxiing should be a fast walking pace, but really as appropriate for the conditions and the surface that you're taxiing on and any hazards that you might have around you. So I always talk about the apron here. You know, you're hearing me refer to outside here a lot, so that's not just referring to the whiteboard. Look at all the hazards out here. If we're not paying attention to where we are taxiing, we might accidentally strike a wing into an aeroplane. So we cannot go too fast. That presents a hazard to anyone on the ground or any other aircraft on the apron. So the speed is controlled with the throttle. Again, we're not going to talk about how it controls the speed here. That's air exercise stuff. It's just introducing the throttle here. And not the brakes. So if we want to change our speed, the first thing we do is change the throttle setting. Only if we need the brakes only if we need them do we use the brakes. But it may not be necessary. Should be an animation there. Did it come up? So something that also affects the speed that the aeroplane is taxiing at is the wind. So that kind of leads you into this one. If you are on your bike, or ask them if they ever ride a bicycle. If you are taxiing with a wind, if you're cycling with a wind coming from behind you, what do you notice about your speed? It picks up really quickly, right? So ask them that question. What about if you've got the wind coming at you? I can feel the bike slowing down. It gets harder to pedal, doesn't it? You've got to put more work into it. So the same thing happens in an aeroplane. If we're taxiing along with the wind behind us, the speed may actually increase more than that fast walking pace. So we have to manage the speed. We have to be aware of where the wind is coming from. Wind quartering is used to ensure that we never lose directional control of the aeroplane and we do not cause a propeller strike. This is probably the most difficult part of this briefing, knowing how much detail to give and where to actually leave it. If we're being honest, you introduce it here in basic terms, but when you're actually teaching taxiing for the first time, you as the instructor take care of this bit. The student is going to have a busy enough time just learning how to start taxiing, control direction, control speed, stop and set the park brake, let alone this stuff. So as an instructor, I usually say to them, I'll take care of this for these first few lessons, and as you get a bit more practiced at taxiing and a bit more confident, I'm going to transfer the responsibility of this over to you, which is why you do need to introduce it here. If not here, then it would have to be crosswind circuits, but that's way down the track. You need to set habits right from the start, okay? I briefly explain why we need to know about this. What we don't want to happen is when we're taxiing around for a gust of wind to get underneath the tail and cause the nose of the aeroplane to flick down towards the ground and possibly cause a propeller strike. That's number one. The second thing we don't want to happen is for the wind to get under one of the wings as we're taxiing around and cause one of those wings to rise, because that will cause a loss of directional control. That is why we do control quartering. Try to keep it simple. I usually start with the elevator. So I say to them, as you'll learn more in the next lesson, the aeroplane has several different control surfaces. There's something called an elevator on the tail here, and there's something called ailerons, which are on the wingtips here. And these can be used for control quartering. Now, if we're taxiing along, and the wind is coming from our front 180 degrees, as indicated by the top part of this diagram here, we want to position the elevator so it's either neutral or back. By having the elevator back, it's deflected upwards like this. And as the air meets the elevator, it creates a force which helps to keep the nose and the propeller of the airplane away from the ground. So just do it simply, okay? Use your finger to represent the force there. That's going to keep the propeller away from the ground. If the wind is coming from behind us, this second 180 degrees, we want the elevator deflected downwards. So this creates a force that helps to keep the nose upwards, the propeller clear of the ground as well. That's what it's all about, okay? The ailerons are slightly more complicated. So if we are taxiing with a wind coming from the front 180 degrees, we want the ailerons positioned into wind. So let's say the wind is coming from here. What we have is the ailerons into wind. This aileron here goes up and this one goes down. That will create a force downwards on this wing, helping to stop the wind getting underneath the wing and lifting it up, causing a loss of control. And then talk about the diving away part as well. So if the wind is now coming from behind us, say from here, we have the ailerons positioned out of wind. So this one goes up, that one goes down. A force is created downwards on this aileron, which helps to keep this wing down, stops it rising, causing a loss of directional control. Other resources you could use the diagrams in the CAA Flight Instructor Guide. They actually have a few like stick figure diagrams about the ailerons actually being deflected and showing the forces on there. I would not say to you that's necessary to go into that much detail, but if your student isn't grasping it, or they're still not getting it after the actual lesson, then print that out for them to show them, or go into it in a bit more detail. But this is the most challenging slide in the briefing, how much detail to give and where to actually say stop. So you're kind of carrying on with your theme of directional control here. So the DA40 has what is known as a castering nose wheel. It's a bit like a shopping trolley wheel, so it's not actually directly connected to the rudder pedals. So when we're actually wanting to change direction or control direction, we always start by using the rudder pedals because they may have enough effectiveness to control the direction to some degree. Then, and only then if we need to, will we use brakes to help us control direction. So as we taxi off the top of the main Massey apron here, there's a series of a couple of turns we're going to have to make. There's a left turn at the top and then there's a right hand turn. So it's important we know how to actually turn and stay on the taxi lines. So if we want to turn to the right, we're going to start by pushing the right rudder pedal all the way in and assess whether or not it is assess whether or not the aircraft is actually turning enough. If it's not turning enough, if we're not staying on the lines or in an appropriate point on the taxiway, then we'll slide our foot up onto the right hand brake pedal and gently press down on the right hand brake pedal and assess whether the turn is sharp enough to stay on the taxi lines. Push it too much and we'll turn too sharply. Don't push it enough and we won't turn sharply enough and we'll end up in the grass. As you do that, you'll probably need to add some power because when you use brake, the airplane slows down. So add some power if you are using brakes to help you turn. And then you'd explain the left-hand one as well, okay? It's the same principle though. Probably the biggest fault with students is using brakes primarily as the method of changing direction and riding the brakes, keeping the feet on the brakes. It's just going to wear the brake pads out. So something you really want to be disciplined with when you're teaching students is really enforce that they're having their heels back on the floor, toes on the rudder bar, and only if necessary are they sliding the feet up onto the brake pads. Not enough power being added as you start to turn is another cause, another fault as well. So they slow down and actually stop, and then you have to have even more power to actually get going again. So I mentioned that Palmerston North has grass taxiways, grass runways, sealed taxiways, sealed runways, and some other aerodromes you may go to later on in your training may even have gravel surfaces. So it's important that we become aware of the considerations of taxiing on each of these. So this is a big discussion slide. I usually ask them, have they ever cycled a bike on grass versus a paved surface? What do they notice? Oh, well, the acceleration is poorer, there's more friction, you've got to put more power into the pedaling to actually get it moving. So in an aeroplane, you would expect poorer acceleration and more power to actually maintain the speed. What about slowing down? If you use the brakes on your bike on a grass surface, it takes longer to stop. Well, it's the same thing in an aeroplane. Talk about seal. So it's just discussion, okay? Ask them questions after you've related it back to either a bike or a car, okay? One of those, or both. The gravel, the big thing there would be directional control. So if you go on a bicycle on a gravel road and try to turn too quickly, you're going to slide, you're going to fall off. In an aeroplane, you will lose directional control if you taxi too fast and try to turn on a gravel surface, if there's loose gravel. Wet versus dry. Again, talk about a bicycle or a car. Have you ever slammed the brakes on your bicycle on wet grass or a wet paved surface? Oh, it takes quite a while to stop, doesn't it? What about if there's puddles there? Oh, yeah, it takes ages to stop. Everyday examples are really important. Dry, we're able to stop a lot quicker. I like to talk about slope here as well, even though it's not specifically on the slide. One of our taxiways in particular has a bit of slope, so it's important that when we're taxiing along that taxiway, we anticipate the effect on the speed. You know, talk about going down a hill on the bike or in the car. If you don't move your foot on the accelerator, what happens as you go down the hill? Well, the speed increases, but we're trying to taxi at a fast walking pace. So what will we need to do? We'll have to control the speed with power. So relate it back to cars or bikes again. Occasionally we may have to cross different surfaces. So for example, if we come off the grass taxiway onto the sealed taxiway or vice versa, an important concept here is try to cross these different surfaces at a 45-degree angle. Do you guys know why that is? This is not a question your students will probably know the answer to, but do you know?
Is it part of preventing prop strokes?
Yes, it can help with that. Yep. Anything else? Or just expand on that a little bit more. How does that help to prevent prop strike?
Because then you're not going to be, if there's a change in the height of the surface that you're going onto, the prop, it's going to come alongside the prop rather than straight into it.
Often, like if you're crossing at a really shallow angle as well, one of the main wheels will hit that curve first and actually elevate the aircraft a little bit, so that can help. But the other thing it does is approaching at an angle actually better allows you to see any lips that there are in the different surfaces. It's not as easy to judge the height of the lip if you're approaching it straight on. And if you assess that, no, that is too much of a lip, I cannot continue taxiing across that. If you're crossing at a 45-degree angle or less, it's much easier to turn around. Think about when you did terrain awareness. We taught you to cross ridges at 45 degrees or less. It's exactly the same principle here. But what you said, Michael, was correct. Just to backtrack a little bit and ask you another question as well. Why is it you think that we teach the student to start controlling direction with the rudder pedals and not brake, even though you know the rudder pedals are not going to do anything? Why do we teach them that?
So that if they move into an aeroplane with a steering nose gear, they're in the right habits to control it?
Yep, that's part of the reason, correct. Anything else?
So not always riding the brakes?
Correct. That's also correct. Anything else? If you've only taught them to control the direction with brakes, and they're on the runway having just landed or they're taking off, what's going to happen if they're using the brakes to actually control direction? Well, you're going to slow down, or you're going to increase your takeoff distance, you're going to pop tyres. The rudder is effective enough at higher speeds or given a strong enough wind to control the direction, isn't it? Even taxiing, it often has a small amount of effectiveness to get the turn actually started, and then you use the appropriate brake. So all of those reasons are why we teach to use the pedals first. So during your time at Massey, there will be 3 aircraft that you are going to be flying. It's important that you become aware of the considerations of flying each. During your career, you'll obviously fly much bigger airplanes. If you want to go to the airline, one day you'll be flying 787s with a 70-odd metre wingspan and 70-odd metres long. So you're going to have to learn to anticipate the space required to manoeuvre these airplanes whilst on the ground, and it's no different for our DA40 and the other airplanes that we fly. It's important to keep a lookout for obstacles at all times when we are taxiing around on the ground. You are most likely to encounter hazards on the ground. So as an instructional technique, land-based incidents are most common as opposed to conflicts in the air. Things for you to know. So we've got 3 wheels. We need to make sure they stay clear of all obstacles, and that nose wheel actually sits ahead of where you're sat in the aeroplane. Furthermore, the propeller is even further forward. It's a couple of meters ahead of your seat, so we've got to make sure the propeller doesn't overhang any obstacles and hit something. The DA40 is also a low-wing aeroplane, which means that the wings are going to be closer to any obstacles on the ground. So ideally, you do not overhang the wings over runway lights or marker boards, because as you can see outside there, there's also structural parts of the wings which go even further, even closer to the ground. So we do not want to run the risk of anything hitting. In a high-wing aeroplane like Cessnas, they might have flown those. That's not so much of an issue because you've got more clearance and you can actually see what is around the wings. So that's an important concept to get across. We've got a 3-metre wheelbase on the DA40, and they do require some space. We cannot turn on the spot. We have to anticipate the space required. We don't want to get ourselves into a position where we have to shut the engine down, get out and push the aeroplane away from obstacles because we haven't anticipated the space required. And then this just talks about the wingspan here as well. So I mentioned that we have rules regarding traffic on the ground, just like we do in a car. So it's important for you to start becoming aware of these. And from today onwards, I'm going to start transferring the responsibility for complying with these taxi rules over to you, but I'll help you out today. Looking out, you'll see this come up time and time in the briefing, okay? The students have to have their eyes outside as often as possible. To the extent where I even teach my students, when they're about to make a turn on the ground, I want to see them looking behind that shoulder to make sure there's nothing there, because there probably isn't at a controlled aerodrome, but I've seen plenty of times where two aeroplanes are taxiing along a taxiway at an uncontrolled aerodrome, side by side. If you're not aware of that and you start turning around, you're going to go straight into the other one, or vice versa. So always teaching the lookout on the ground as well. Airmanship is critical. Set that habit right from the start. So there are a few giveaway rules. We always give way to aircraft taking off or landing. So for us, this means we do not enter a runway unless we've given permission to by ATC in the case of this aerodrome. And we make sure that there is no one taking off, no one landing before we actually enter. If two aircraft are approaching head on, we both either stop or we alter our headings to the right. So this is where actually the whiteboard comes in handy. Here's an example, two aeroplanes taxiing straight towards each other. Realise there's a collision risk there, so what can we do? If there's not enough room to manoeuvre around each other, we come to the stop and figure out what to do after that. But if the taxiway or the apron is wide enough, we both alter heading out to the right, and that will help us to keep clear of one another. Do you know why we do it that way? Why is it out to the right?
Because you fly from the left seat
Yeah.
to get the most visibility.
Yep. So tell your student that as well. Giving way to traffic on the right. Draw a diagram up with this. I usually have like the Massey apron here. And then let's draw in Delta, maybe a bit of hotel there. You can have the fuel pump thing in there if you want. And draw some aircraft on there and actually give a few different examples. It's up to you how many and which specific examples you do, but what if we are here wanting to go to the Massey apron and we've got another aircraft here going that way? So talk through who has to give way in that situation, and then position the airplane in different places. What if you're here wanting to go that way and there's an aircraft also wanting to go that way? Give a few examples, all right? We've already discussed this one, but keep well clear when overtaking, so plenty of wingtip clearance. We want to be 100% assured of not hitting anything. And as a general consideration, a courtesy, usually we give way to aeroplanes that are larger than us or have more engines or are faster. It's always quite exciting when the tower tells an ATR to sit and wait for us in a little DA-40, but sadly that doesn't happen that often. Okay, so generally we have to give way to them. They're faster and more expensive to operate, and they've got passengers on board who are paying a lot of money. There are a few checks that we do of the instruments once we start taxiing to make sure they are working normally. So just point out on this slide what those instruments are that you're checking. The compass, which shows direction. The horizontal situation indicator, which also shows direction. The slip skid bar. And then the attitude indicator here in blue, which shows whether or not the wings are level. Then I just run through an example. So when we are turning left on the ground, we want to check that the numbers on the compass and the HSI are decreasing. So not all students understand what is meant by that. So if we were taxiing facing north and then we make a left-hand turn, the headings should go from say 360 to 350 to 330. You get the idea? Just actually run through what you mean by numbers are decreasing. So turning left, numbers on the HSI and compass are decreasing. The skid bar, that little bar at the bottom of the triangle there, should go out to the right, and the attitude indicator here should remain just like it is now with the wings level with those two triangles there aligned with one another. Now when we're turning to the right, numbers on the HSI and compass increase, we skid left, so skid bar out to the left, and the attitude indicator remains wings level. So just run through that. I like to point out to a student in this flight, more so than now, that they should always say when they're starting a checklist and when they've finished a checklist, because if they just do this quietly, how do you even know they've done it? And certainly this always comes up in flight tests where an examiner accuses a student, well, you didn't do this particular check. A really easy way of avoiding that is just to say, commencing pre-takeoff checks or whatever, or starting pre-takeoff checks, and pre-takeoff checks completed. How easy is that to avoid that ambiguity and to make sure everyone is on the same page? So I mentioned that there are few emergencies that we could be faced with when we're taxiing. Very rare, but probably the worst one that could happen to us is a brake failure. There are certain things that we can do to figure out if we've had a brake failure before it becomes critical. So just after we start taxiing, we do a brake check so that we know right then and there before we go any further whether or not the brakes are working. Also, just before we land, we do pre-landing checks where we check to see if the brakes have any pressure in them so that we know if the brakes are working for our landing and we can plan accordingly. If we have had a brake failure, these are the items that I want you to memorize. We don't want to be having to grab a checklist out in a situation where we are approaching obstacles and going to hit them. So we close the throttle so that we can slow down as quickly as possible. Control the direction, so you may be able to steer clear or partly clear of obstacles through the use of the rudder pedals. And then we need to shut the engine down to prevent any further damage. So the fuel selector gets turned off, ignition gets turned off, and the master switch gets turned off. That's for the electrics, so minimizing the risk of a fire. It's not magnetos, it's master. Make sure you know those checks as well. And then in that situation, we would stop and let the tower know what has happened, and we're probably going to have to get someone to tow us back in. Over the course of the students' training, introduce them to brake failures in different places. So on the runway, simulate a brake failure. Like you've just gone to slow down, no brake pressure, what are you going to do? Ask them about it. Ask them as a whiteboard exercise what they would do in different situations with a brake failure as well. Today's not the day to do it, but before they do their PPL test or first solo, you should have introduced them to all of that. Airmanship. So this is all about setting good habits and practices and looking after ourselves and others in the flying environment. There's that word again, look out. We must always be looking out and listening out for what other people are doing when they're taxiing around. So when we hear another person make a radio call, we want to start building a mental picture of where they are, what they are doing, and whether they are going to present a conflict with our own plan. Really important, so don't forget to mention that to your student. And it's the same when you're actually out in the training area, isn't it? You always listen to radio calls, you assess if they're a threat. If they're not, then say so. If they are, then you've got to do something about it, right? So that's what I mean by setting habits right from the start. Do it now. If we are in a situation where you're not sure whether the wings, propeller or tyres are clear of an obstacle, opportunity for a question here, what would you do? See if they remember what you said earlier. I will shut the engine down and push the aeroplane away from the obstacle. Or maybe we even call someone to just verify. Maybe the tower can have a look for us. Maybe if we're on the apron, a duty instructor can have a look and just check that the wings are actually clear. So ask them a few questions here. And I mentioned earlier that part of this lesson, you need to start becoming familiar with the different taxiways, the holding points, and the different runways that we have. At the end of this lesson, I will show you where to find that on the AVPlan, and then that'll be your homework, familiarising yourself with that. The great benefit is, after a couple of lessons, you will have all of this information memorised, and then when you're actually taxiing, you do not have to be looking inside at your iPad. You can have your eyes outside where they should be, looking for hazards. So that's the point of that. The propeller is really like a fan, and like a fan, it throws air backwards. So as a general consideration, if we are parked on this first line of aircraft here and we're facing east out that way, before you start the engine up, it's a good idea to just go and tell the engineers, hey, we're about to start up, and then it's up to them whether or not they close the hangar doors, because we don't want to blast them with air and cause an aircraft canopy or something else to go flying in the hangar. So it's just a courtesy. So always teach them that. It's not a NOTAC anymore, it's an SOP, but remember, we don't drag the aeroplanes anymore, we just tell the engineers we're about to start. And then it's up to them whether they close the hangars or not. Human factors. So recapping on what this is, human factors is really about being in a peak physiological or physical and psychological state to handle the fast-paced nature of the flying environment. So these are some of the things that you need to think about before you come in for flights every time. It's the I'm SAFE acronym. It covers the main fitness to fly aspects. You don't want to be flying when you're feeling unwell. That can cause you to be fatigued. It can lead to distraction, slower information processing. It can have complications for when you're in the air. So run through why this actually is important for them to know. Remember, this is possibly the first time they've actually seen it, so you have to give some context to it. So if you are feeling unwell, always just send me a text or call up the Aero Club or whoever it is and let them know that you're not feeling well. No questions asked, but I'd rather you let me know early if you're not feeling well, particularly if you have blocked ears or are congested, because that's the stuff that really creates problems, right? Barotrauma. Oops, what's going on? Medication. So you don't need to ask specific questions there, but I usually say to them, if you are taking any regular medications or prescription medications, it's best to consult your general practitioner about what effects they may have on your ability to fly an aeroplane, because we don't generally know that, and it's personal stuff as well, so just refer them to the GP. Stress. We need to arrive in a focused mental state, so any personal problems we've got, when we walk out that door there to the aeroplane, we leave our problems on this side of the door or the gate, whatever the case is. So if you do have some problems on the day that you're flying, something's come up, please just call, text me to cancel your flight. You know, actually just tell them what you want them to do in that process, because we all have those days, right? Alcohol and drugs, self-explanatory, right? It's the same within a car. There's a general rule of 10 hours from one standard drink to getting in an aeroplane you're about to fly. Just one standard drink, more time if you've drunk more. Fatigue is something we want to avoid, so always make sure you're well rested, you get a good sleep the night before. Otherwise we'll get distracted and information processing is lower. And it does pay to make sure you've eaten something for the same reasons as well. This one you do need to talk to your students about, because they often have this fixation that if they don't eat anything they won't feel motion sick, whereas it tends to actually have the opposite effect. Eat something sensibly, like not a heavy meal if they're prone to motion sickness, but it's not good general practice to not have eaten anything. So I normally ask our students, you know, are you prone to motion sickness? You know, just so you know that. It's quite useful going into a flight if you're already aware of that information. And just reassure them, hey, that's quite normal. This happens to many students, and usually it's the case that the more flying you do, the more you get used to the sensations of flying and you desensitize to it. But if you do feel unwell at any stage, just let me know, and there's air conditioning vents. So just really reassure them. Some students are really anxious about that, and they don't tell you until they're about to throw up, and then inevitably they don't get to the bag in time and it goes everywhere, so that's never fun to clean up. So this is something that the students should think about themselves every time they've got a flight on the day before they come in for the flight. Aircraft management. So there's a few concepts I want to introduce you to today. One is the use of the throttle. We want to be smooth on the throttle. Just like you're smooth on the accelerator on your car, you don't stamp your foot down on it. What would happen to your engine? Well, it would rev really loudly, might cough and sputter. What if you tried to drink that bottle of water there, Callum, over the space of a couple of seconds? Well, you'd cough and sputter as well, wouldn't you? So we're just gentle with the throttle. We don't want it to cough and sputter. And I'll demonstrate this to you in the flight. Now, we also be positive with the throttle now. This means really to act with assertiveness and confidence, to know and to get used to how much power you need to use to control speed and help you out with changing direction when you're using the brakes. And this will get easier for you the more flying you do as well. Another general concept is we always close the throttle prior to releasing or applying the brakes. In a car, when you want to stop, you don't leave one foot on the accelerator and put the other on the brake, do you? So it's the same in the aeroplane. So when you want to slow down or stop in an aeroplane, You bring the throttle back to idle, its minimum power setting, and then you use the brakes. See, that makes so much sense when you talk about that in a car, because you don't do that, do you? You don't leave one foot on the accelerator and the other on the brake. What would possibly be the point of that? Engine RPM. So it's the power setting developed by the engine that actually controls our speed. Now, over here on this right-hand side of the diagram, you can see the various instrument indications for our aeroplane. Things like power settings, fuel pressure, oil temperature. You don't need to get too carried away with that in today's lesson. But there's the RPM gauge there. When we're taxiing around on the ground, we visually assess by looking outside whether we are going fast enough or at an appropriate speed. And if we're not, then we change the throttle setting. We do not need to look inside at this gauge before we change the throttle setting. The only time we really do that is when we have come to a complete stop and we set 1,200 RPM as our minimum idling ground setting. That's an important one to get across, because some students develop this fixation that they should never taxi with less than 1,200 RPM, and then they start using the brakes against power, which is not what we want, okay? So looking outside is where we assess our speed. This last point here, what's that principle all about? Student's not going to know, but what is it describing? Yeah, it's describing the property of inertia, right? So initially you'll find to get the aeroplane moving, you have to add quite a lot of power. To overcome this property called inertia, it's the tendency of the aeroplane to stay at rest. But once you've started moving, you can reduce the power so that you're taxiing at an appropriate speed, because then it has inertia of movement. It wants to continue moving. So don't go too crazy with your explanation of that. It doesn't always work on the apron here because it's a fairly smooth surface, and also if you're parked that way, because it's sloped, the aeroplane just tends to move straight away. But it's really useful to emphasize this if you're parked that way, and even go stop on the grass runway and show, oh, it's quite a lot of power there to get moving, isn't it? And now we're actually moving, the airplane's accelerating quickly, we've got to reduce the power. So make sure you do highlight this to them. And you could ask a question here for this next point, taxi speed. Hey, do you remember what the taxi speed should be? Hopefully they say, oh yeah, no more than a fast walking pace, but appropriate for the conditions and the surface and the wind. So ask them questions. You've already told them about this. You do not want to turn at high speed. So something for you guys as instructors to be careful of is when you go to vacate a runway, make sure the airspeed, ground speed is slow, okay? Because we sometimes see students try to turn and the airplane still doing 40 knots indicated speed. That will put a huge strain on the wheels and the undercarriage. So you do not want to allow that. Don't slam on the brakes to attempt to get off the runway. If we have to roll past the intersection, that's fine, we just backtrack. I'm not going to talk too much about these next few slides, I'll just show you what's on there, but we're talking about comfort here. So the aeroplane has a heater and it has air conditioning. So it's important that you are comfortable wherever you're flying the aeroplane. You've got an air conditioning vent up on the left-hand side of the instrument panel, which you can move around, you can turn it on and off. There's one in the back for the flights where you're monitoring. There's a couple in the back, and there's a couple above your head as well. So when you go actually do this flight, show them how to move all of these things. Cabin heat, show them how to use these, point out which levers are which, what they all do. And it's a bit hard to see, but these photos here are showing you where the hot air goes. So this is for windscreen defrost, and this one's in, I think it's in the rear seat footwell, down by, in the back there. And then for the pilot, right, the lighting's not very good, but there's a little hole just in there where it comes out near your feet. I'll just put those blinds down. Still hard to see. Oh, there we go. It circles it for you. Okay, so then that brings us to the air exercise. So this is the practical bit. What are we actually going to be doing in the flight today, or in the lesson today, I should say? Going back to our scenario, we are leaving the NASI apron. We've been given permission to taxi out to the main apron for our checks. So the The first thing is to move off. We must have a good lookout before we do anything else. Make sure there's no hazards around us, no one's walking towards us from in front or behind, there's no loose obstacles, no aircraft are in our way of taxiing. Think about wind tip clearances as well. Then you can ask questions for a lot of this next stuff because you've already talked about some of the concepts. So what do we do before we release the park brake? Ask them that question before you bring up bullet point number 2. Oh yes, yeah, we close the throttle and then we move the park brake lever to the off position. Then what we need to do is increase the power to start moving. Initially, a reasonable amount of power to overcome the inertia, and then we can reduce it so that we don't accelerate too much. At this point, we also do our brake check, and both the pilot and the student, both the instructor and the student does that. So how do we come to a stop? Ask them questions around that. Hopefully they can tell you this process because you've talked about it a few times already. And emphasize to them, don't slam the brakes on, okay? We just need to press down smoothly, make sure they're working. What I would say to you is when you've got brand new students, it is easier to come to a complete stop, but as they're more experienced, you don't necessarily have to stop to actually do your brake check. If you're pressing down on them and they're working, clearly you don't need to come to a complete stop, but it probably is best for new students to do that so we can hand the controls over and give them time to do that. Setting the park brake, ask them about that. See, we've already discussed all of this stuff. The animation's a bit weird on this slide. It brings that one up first, and then another clip brings that one, and then it's normal. So ask them about how do you control speed, and this is where you get a little bit more detail about the specifics. So if we're going too fast, we reduce the power, and if we're going too slow, we increase the power. If we want to slow down faster, sorry if that doesn't, that's an oxymoron, isn't it? If we want to slow down more, we reduce the power more. If we're going really too fast, we'll close the throttle and apply the brakes evenly and smoothly. So talk about that stuff as well. Constant direction, we need to look where the aircraft is heading, where we want it to be, where we want to position it, maybe for the taxi lines, and we use the rudder and brake as necessary to control the direction. So we always start off with the we always start off with the rudder and then slide our foot up onto the relevant brake if necessary, adding a little bit of power. So ask them about it, okay? By now we should just be doing questions. Turning. Did I miss anything there? The only other thing to talk about here, which isn't mentioned, is once you've turned as much as you want to, you've got to centralize the pedals, right? So you must remember to tell them to do that. It's a bit like once you finish going around a corner in a car, you've got to centralize the wheel again. So you've got to centralize the pedals in an aeroplane. So if we're turning left, we've used left rudder, we've used left brake, we've finished turning. Now we centralize the pedals by pushing down on the opposite rudder pedal, not brake pedal. Make sure you tell them that. And it's up to you what you make with this conclusion. You could ask a few questions here, but mostly if you've questioned them in the air exercise, you'll have a very clear understanding by now whether or not they have understood the concepts that you've talked about. Maybe you ask some questions like, what would be the effect of taxiing on a downslope? How would you control your speed then? Something like that. Homework is what I'd ask them about now. Show them where to find the aerodrome charts. You could even bring it up on the computer there, guide them through where it is on Go Pre-Flight or AvPlan, and both of those, and then ask them to have a read of that and the mass brief before the flight. So their preparation should be review the mass brief before every single flight, particularly the air exercise section. All right, so that took me about an hour, but that's with all of the instructional stuff thrown into it. I would suggest it will probably take you between 40 and 45 minutes to deliver that when you do it to me or Jess, because you'll just be presenting as if we're students, okay? I'll just have a look, make sure there's no other instructional techniques I wanted to discuss. Covered it all with it. That was everything. Do you have any questions at this point on that briefing? Okay, we'll have a 5-minute break then, 11:30, and then we'll carry on, eh? Effects of controls. Ooh, that's vivid. Sore back standing up for that one. Not very nice out there, is it?